Welcome everyone to this conference, and again formally I should say I welcome you all to the second SANEM Annual International Development Conference SIDC 2021 on COVID-19 recovery, context and priorities. The first SIDC, we call it SIDC, SANEM International Development Conference. It was held in October 2020 and it had the title, the theme COVID-19 and Development Challenges. But we know that during the COVID, what we are actually going through, that COVID crisis, now there is a kind of recovery process. And also we want to understand the kind of country experiences. What are the contexts, what are the priorities, and what needs to be done to confront this crisis at the same time, to get into the recovery process and to learn from each other from these country experiences. So this conference is actually, hosting 30 papers. 30 papers will be presented in different sessions. There will be one keynote address by Professor Len Pritchett, and we all know him. And the keynote session will be immediately after this paper presentation session. There will be 3 panel discussion sessions involving Professor Rehan Sohan, Professor Deepak Nair, Professor David Hume, and Dr. Martin Rama as distinguished panelists. And in particular, there will be one session involving the economic students from South Asia. And that is going to happen tomorrow in the morning. And they are also going to present 8 papers. And I also welcome you to attend that session. So I also welcome everyone and request everyone to look at the agenda. And there are many interesting sessions, many interesting papers. And I look forward to your active participation in those sessions. Now, coming to that particular session, I welcome the chair of the session, Dr. Poshraj Pandey. He is the chairman of South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment, SAWTE. And in this session, there will be 4 papers. And I welcome all the presenters of this session. I also welcome Dr. Orpita Mukherjee. She is the professor of Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, ICRIER, based in Delhi, as the discussant and in this session. So I also welcome all the participants who are actually joining this conference from all over the world, and thank you so much for joining us. So before starting the session, a few housekeeping announcements. The guidelines of the session have been shared with you all. The participants, apart from the paper presenters, actually, they will write their questions or comments in the chat box. As due to the time constraint, we may not be able to allow participants to speak in the session. However, exception will always be there, and will, depending on the situation and the time, we'll judge accordingly. So the presenters here, there are 4 presenters in this session. We'll hear a notification from SANEM team. Actually, there is a timekeeper. So each presenter will get 14 minutes for their presentation. So at 12th minute, there will be a notification that only 2 minutes are left. And at the final notification, actually, you will hear from the timekeeper that, dear presenter, your time is over at the 14th minute. With this, I request Dr. Poshraj Pandey to kindly take over and conduct the session. Over to you, Dr. Pandey.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Salim. Good afternoon, distinguished participants. First, I would like to join Dr. Salim to welcome you all in the first session of second SANEM International Development Conference, which is basically focused on the COVID-19 recovery, its context and priorities. Well, I would also like to thank and congratulate SANEM and especially Dr. Salim for organizing this event, and also providing this opportunity for me. Well, this COVID-19 pandemic, it has sent shock waves, I would say, shock wave through society and economies around the world, and has created both medical crisis and economic crisis. On economic side, the containment measures and restrictions adopted by various governments to contain COVID have simultaneously created negative supply shock as well as negative demand shocks. I mean, if you look at this shock, theoretically, this shocks was created through, I would say, 4 channels. The first one is the direct effect of a reduction in employment and income. Second is the increase in international transaction cost because of disruption in supply chains. The third channel is basically, on service sectors, that's the sharp decline in travel. It has very big effect in the economy for both supply side and demand side. And also the decline in the demand for service requiring proximity between people. These are the major channels that has affected our economy because of this pandemic. Here, if we're looking at the supply side, supply capacity of firm is reduced as productivity decline, either because the workers are infected by the virus, or because their workers need to engage in social distancing as required by the government or voluntarily to slow down the spread of the virus, or because the supply chain of the necessary intermediate inputs are disrupted because of the measure we adopted to contain this pandemic. And this has resulted in the rising cost of imports and exports of goods and services. And which has, as a result, which has reduced total international trade. And also, we observed some productivity loss. And looking at the demand side, since people lost their employment and income, household demand has declined abruptly, resulting in unprecedented negative demand shocks. And in addition, if you look at specific sectors, particularly service sector, such as travel, tourism, hotel, restaurants, among others, they suffered more intense negative shocks as customers stay at home either voluntarily for fear of being exposed to the virus or involuntarily because of the lockdown restriction of the government. So in addition to this direct impact of this supply demand and supply shocks, we also observed contraction in foreign direct investment. And we also observed some financial shocks and also falling oil prices. Well, these are the major impact I see at macro levels and impact of this pandemic. Here, I just want to highlight some of the issues which we are going to discuss in this session. Well, so this as I mentioned, this COVID pandemic has led to significant disruption in global value chain. Which have we experienced this global value chain. That increasing, particularly in the last 30 years, and most of the producer countries, they wanted to join those either in regional or global value chain. But the problem is, we observe or we experience that disruption in value chain, and it has given rise to growing protectionism and nationalism. And also now people have also started talking about industrial sovereignty. And it has threatened the traditional globalization process. And on another major development is, I would say, is the positive side. That is, COVID-19 has significantly accelerated digitalization in all sectors. Given the potential threat of infection transmission through physical space of places, now the virtual space has, we have expedited, it has gained much more relevance and centrality, including this virtual. Otherwise, we have to travel to Dhaka and participate in this. Now we are having this virtual conference. And even during recovery phase, it is expected that online working, e-commerce, and digitally organized logistics will be expanded also. But the negative side of this digitalization is we have this digital divide among countries and also in the countries. And this digital divide will increase the risk of further increasing inequality and new form of economic and political marginalizations of masses. That is another risk. So what I see is, because of this disruption in global value chain, as well as the threat of increasing inequality that threatens our traditional globalization process and the demands for new kind of globalization. That is the one issue we are going to discuss in this session. And the second issue is basically related to food security and also food waste. And if you look at the agriculture sector, and particularly I'm saying for South Asian countries, the impact of COVID-19 on agriculture in our region have been substantial because of the limited mechanization and high labor intensity in agriculture. But the problem is, because of lockdown and all these things, labor has been quarantined, and because of the lockdown, there is restricted movement of the labor. So labor-intensive agriculture could not get sufficient labor in the farming. So that is own impact, and it would affect our labor productivity and production. So that directly affects our food availability, right? From food security perspectives. And again, it's not only the issues of food availability because of this pandemic. As household income, particularly of daily wage workers and workers in informal sector, has declined, then it directly affected access to food. So from this perspective, there is some risk on food security, on ensuring food security because of this pandemic. And another, a third point, particularly what we are going to discuss is, in order to contain this COVID-19, there is need for unimpeded, timely, and secure access to quality, safe, efficacious, and affordable health products, including vaccine and also technology. But here, the intellectual property rights have direct bearings on diversifying and scaling up production of, here, particularly at this moment, I would say that's the production of vaccine to meet global needs and also ensure vaccine justice and to go in the process of economic recovery. So here, intellectual property rights and particularly TRIPS agreement that has a strong bearing on not only in both for containing this pandemic COVID and also to promote economic recovery. So these are the issues we are going to discuss here, and to discuss the issue of globalization. We have Dr. Abdullah Altun is Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Gebze Technical University, Turkey. And on issues of food security and food waste, we have Sheila Khatun from Department of Economics, Maulana Bashani Science and Technology University. And okay, let me look at the agenda. And we have Thatchajini Panchalingam to discuss on the issues of food losses from Harvard Urtin School of Public Health and Longevity Science, University of California, USA. And we have discussant Dr. Arpita Mukherjee, my very old friend. She's a professor and at Indian Council of Research and International Economic Affairs. So with this background, I invite Dr. Abdullah Altum for presentation. Dr. Abdullah, now you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me first share my screen. I think now everyone can see my screen, I think. First of all, I would like to convey my deepest respect to all distinguished guests and conference participants, and special thanks to Dr. Selim Reyhan, Dr. Pandi, and Dr. Mukherjee, and all team members of the South Asian Network of Economic Modeling.
Can you please put it to the as a slideshow?
Okay. Now, okay.
Yes, thank you. I think this is fine. Thank you. Go ahead.
We all witness very difficult times so far since the beginning of the pandemic. Of course, there were predictions for a possible pandemic, and even it was believed that pandemic would start from Far East in numerous articles. But pandemic hit all countries, no matter developed or developing countries, contrary to expectations, common expectations, since mainly believed that such a pandemic would damage mainly developing or underdeveloped countries. However, the situation now is clear, as we all see. Not much easy to draw a concrete picture for the post-pandemic world, since we are still not really aware of we are in which phase of the pandemic. Since even when we became happy for something to succeed, then we saw many different new waves of the pandemic. And interesting, the mutations or something also make the situation worse. But also the data side is another problem, since even only 70% of the countries only report their trade data to United Nations Comtrade, and sometimes took some more, required some more years for a concrete picture to understand the long-term impacts, and we are still in the first half of the 2021. But an important point here is whether the pandemic is a very new thing or triggering a new wave, or pandemic is the continuing of some previous problems in the global economy. Actually, the answer is the global economy had many problems before pandemic, and the pandemic just makes the situation worse. So to say some concrete things for the future of the pandemic, let's see the problems which pandemic deepened. First of all, 2007 and 2018, global food crisis appears as an important problem. Especially, this makes countries to focus self-sufficiency issues much. Then global economic crisis as a starting point for the protectionist sentiments and trade wars deepened the issue. And now COVID-19 also is a really make the situation worse in terms of both self-sufficiency and both in terms of protectionist sentiments. When looking at the trade data, this is bilateral trade data for between high, low, and middle income members of the World Trade Organization. The 2008 crisis, but also we observe its real impact on or after a year. The trade between the among developed countries, among high-income countries, really lost increasing trend, and also we see the increasing trade from north countries. North refers developed countries, south refers developing countries. Again, the trade from north to south increases, but as to developing countries, the export of developing countries not affected in the same trend as if the exports of developed countries. This, from the perspectives of overall trade and from the perspectives of intermediate trade, both, we saw the North loses, the developed countries, loses power in global economy. Instead, South countries, both among South countries and from South to North countries, there is an increasing trade flows. Actually, only 70% of the countries report their trade data to United Nations Comtrade database, but when checking their trend, this trend is very consistent with the all other countries' trade data, previous trade data of other countries available. And looking at these, we saw approximately 9.5 decrease in overall trade activities and 11.5 decrease in intermediate trade activities. Why intermediate trade is important for us? Since it reflects the nature of the global value chains. And when looking at the monthly data, trade data, we see the impact of shocks. But after a certain time, we witness a quick recovery. However, we should remember that firms, companies work with some inventory. So in difficult times, they can consume their inventories, and after a certain recovery period, they can easily compensate these inventories. So I say these quick recovery impacts as inventory impacts. Thus, what will happen in the future of the global economy probably requires some years to observe the real situation. An important point about the changing dynamics of global value chains. Here, we calculate simple and global value chain participation from full EURA data, the biggest global input-output databases, and very big task for us approximately 20 days, 7 and 24 computer running 128 gigabyte RAM, a big capacity computer. We calculate global value chains, participation ratios according to the methodology of one. And this ratio is now, this is for forward, this is for backward participation, and this ratio is simple over complex ratio. So since the 1990s, the simple over complex ratio decreases. This means complex global value chain activities increases until 2000. Why? Since these years, we witness an Argentine crisis, we witness the end of the business boom in USA and early 20,000 recession in developed countries. Then in 28, also the problem arises again with a global crisis, and again we start to face with the increasing simple participation ratios. That is, complex activities started to contract again. From the perspectives of backward participation, again we see the same problems, and thus we see a trend in global economy from complex activities to simple activities. What's complex activities? Intermediate goods cross-border twice in complex activities. In simple activities, just cross-border once. And with the problems, especially 2011 accepted as the starting point for real contraction in global value chains, and we see that there is a decreasing trend in complex activities of global value chain. As to foreign direct investments, here I give figures for stocks for high-income countries and other countries, and it is very clear that high-income countries has a really big portion of foreign direct investments, and this means still the power. This shows the power of the game making in global economy from a perspective. However, this also changing step by step. This is flows of foreign direct investments. This is for developed countries, high-income countries, and this is for developing countries. Actually, for the side of developing countries, this is an incremental increase. But from the perspectives of high-income countries, this is very unstable movements, and especially there are especially the problems will continue. But let's connecting the dots. But before connecting the dots, I want to focus on the trade of capital goods. Why? Since we are on the verge of third great unbundling. What this means? The increasing robotics of the machines, actually the increasing automation of the capital goods. Thus, this means decreasing capital over labor ratio. And the trade exports from developed countries to developed countries, we see the breaking point after the 2008 global crisis, and we see the increasing trend of the South countries. This is exports from north to south, first one, and this one from south to north. Actually, this all gives us a sign for a new increasing role of South countries in global economy. Also, this capital goods.
Dear paper presenter, you have 2 minutes till the end of your presentation.
Okay, now
Thank you.
I am coming to latest points of presentation. Actually, the role of consumers shouldn't be ignored, and I give here the constituents of the global economy. Intellectual property. Now we are all know that even half of the patents, worldwide patent applications, were made by China. So there is an interesting change in intellectual property as we see the increasing role of salt, but no countries also now trying to make a new attempt towards changing the game. New strategy in first layer. They first try to define new products with incremental or radical innovations. Then probably we will see new definitions, new development of capital intermediate goods. And third level, of course, the power of changing the minds of the consumers by cultural value chains, or the power of consumers. Still, more countries have power to make something to change the gravity of the economy, global economy. But let me conclude. First of all, the changing power balances of countries in the global world from north to south become much clearer. Then the possible breaking of complex global value chain activities face us with more simpler activities. Also, the rise of machines with more automations, probably this will change the combination of production factors, and instead we will face the globalization in north, but we will face a new south-oriented globalization wave, decreasing complex and simple global value chain activities, and also very soon we will see the increasing competitive efforts of global south in global economy. I want to thank again, since time restrictions, I try to summarize a complete picture from my perception.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Abdullah Alsun. In fact, this pandemic exploded at a special traveling moment for the old economy. And in fact, and at the time when old order, trade wars, geoeconomics, economic nationalism, paralysis of multilateralism, North-South divide. I mean, these are the headlines, I mean, news. If you look at, I mean, in international newspaper. So here, Dr. Abdullah Alsun, I thank you for your optimism, I mean, particularly with regard to this re-globalizations. Now let me move to the agenda, and I invite Dr. Thadji, I'm not sure whether I pronounce properly, Panchalingam. Dr. Panchalingam, now you have the floor. And please remember, you have 14 minutes to make presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, thank you for the opportunity to present in the SANM conference of this year. I'm Thadji Panchalingam, and this is a work with my co-author Sanka Vijay Singha from the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. Today I'm going to talk about food loss in trade. It's a case study of South Asia using the import refusal reports of the United States Food and Drug Administration. First of all, food loss is different from food waste, because food loss is the decrease in the quantity or quality of food resulting from decisions and actions along the food supply chain that starts with the post-harvesting up to, but excluding retailing, food service providers, and consumers. So everything other than this is categorized as food waste, which is a different issue. A lot of food loss happen in trade. Specifically, if you look at this figure on the right of the screen, It shows the food loss index, which is the percentage of food loss in various regions across the world. And you can see that world food loss is somewhere between 12 and 16%, whereas the Central and Southern Asia food loss index is higher than that, somewhere between 20 and 24. So South Asia face an above average food loss. So we focus in this study on food loss in international trade due to import refusals, and we use the import refusals faced by the South Asian countries at the US border. So the United States Food and Drug Administration is responsible for overseeing the food safety of most of the food sold in the United States, as well as imported food from foreign countries. So this is a little bit complicated process in the sense that Food and Drug Administration doesn't have enough budget to analyze each and every product that is imported. So they use an algorithm that is based on the previous food refusal data that kind of predict the products that should be analyzed or detained before they can be actually allowed, verified and allowed into the local commerce. So import refusal is FDA's final decision that detained shipment is in violation of FDA laws and regulations. Sometimes these violations are not necessarily food safety issues, but more like misbranding or missing labeling or labels missing the standards that's expected from the FDA. So a refused shipment must either be destroyed or exported under the supervision of Customs and Border Protection within 90 days. So this process causes a lot of food loss if destroyed, or trade deflection, and also cause additional compliance costs for the exporters. So based on the existing literature, there are some evidence about the type of food categories that undergo the most of the import refusals, as well as studies talk about drivers of import refusals in a global level or developed country level, and also Grant and Anders study talk about the trade deflection that happens as a result of refusals on trade. But in this paper, the motivation is that there's no study that focuses on the import refusals of South Asian food exports. Given that background, we investigate the scope of import refusals to identify the most common types of food categories that are refused, as well as factors determining the import refusals. And in future work, we are planning to extend this to investigate the effect of import refusals on South Asia's food trade in terms of trade deflection and reorientation of trade. A little bit on methods and data. So we do we start with a descriptive analysis to detect the patterns of import refusals from 2001 to up to 2021, based on the publicly available data from FDA. And we identify the top food groups and causes of refusals of each South Asian country. And then we estimate a simple regression that quantify the factors associated with the import refusals of South Asian exports. Basically here, the Y, the dependent variable, is the number of shipment refusals per million of food exports to the US. In the product category, we categorize the product based on the United States Department of Agriculture's previous work on import refusals. So we measure the number of shipment refusals per million of food exports as the independent variable. And then for explanatory variables, we include a bunch of economic and demographic and technological characteristics of the exporting country. And we also include country, sector, meaning the food category, and year fixed effects. So we get the import refusal data from the Food and Drug Administration and a bunch of explanatory variables from the World Development Indicators that's available from World Bank. We include GDP, agriculture as a percentage of GDP, and we proxy for the education of the labor force that participate in the manufacturing and trade by using the gross secondary enrollment due to some data limitation and missing values. This is the best so far we could find. And then we also include economic complexity index, that's a proxy for the technological expertise of the exporting country. And then we also include trade as a percentage of GDP to capture the openness. So some of the key results, as I mentioned, based on the descriptive statistics here, this figure here shows the import refusals, the number of refusals on y-axis, and these are these boxes here are the major product categories, food product categories that face the highest number of import refusals. So spices, flavors, and salt, which is this light green category, face the highest number of refusals, followed by fishery and seafood products. And it's important to note that these two product categories are also the top exports from the region to the US, so that could that might be reflective in this figure. And we can see somewhat declining trend in refusal of spices, flavors, and salts across the years. Starting from 2010, the bar is kind of decreasing in size. And we also tabulate the top 5 exports of food product categories from South Asia that face import refusals by the FDA. And most of the food categories from various countries include spices, vegetable and vegetable products, fruits and fruits products, and bakery, some snacks, grain and milk grain products as well. So we can see a variety of products that face import refusals across over the years. And then we also tabulate the frequency of refusal charge types by country from 2001 to 2021. So on the y-axis here, you can see the different codes. These codes mean the different charge types. So for an example here, the Bangladesh, the most frequent refusal charge is salmonella in the food products, or failure to meet the standards of the nutrition label. And the third one is going to be the filthy. Some products are found with some other decomposed substances. And similarly, for India, if you compare both graphs, they kind of show the similar reasons. Again, filthy, salmonella, failure to meet the standards of the nutrition labels, and failure to list the ingredients properly. And again, for Pakistan, you can see the similar reasons. In addition to that, using unsafe color additives is also cited as
Dear
one
paper
of the
presenter, you have 2 minutes left to end your presentation. Thank you.
Unsafe color additives as one of the most cited reasons. Sri Lanka faces the similar kind of reasons. So the most cited reasons include filthy products, salmonella detection, failure to bear the required nutritional label, unsafe color additives, and failure to show the ingredients as the prominent ingredients in the required way. So most of these cited reasons can be categorized as a manufacturing failure and lack of technical know-how in labeling. So results from the main the regression we ran. Here we show the variables, the explanatory variables include, as well as whether we include the fixed effects in each of the model. The first column is the aggregate refusal, meaning we aggregate across all food categories, all the refusal. And the second column, we include the categories separately. So for each category, the major categories, fisheries, sea products, fruits and fruit products, some categories are not shown here due to the space limit. And these, the second column does not include 0 refusals. The third column include 0 refusal. So the main key results here is that agriculture as a percentage of GDP has a negative correlation with the import refusal. So the dependent variable is import refusal per million of food products. And trade has a positive correlation with the refusal. And we see certain categories, fishery and seafood products, fruit and fruit products compared to the base category, which is bakery products, face higher number of refusals. So in a nutshell, that means the agriculture and trade are negatively
Dear presenter,
and
your time is over.
correlated. But however, these estimates might reflect higher shares of seafood from South Asia. And so we are planning to extend this analysis by including other regions as well as talking about trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panchalingam, for venturing into new areas of research. That's food loss. Well, let me add something over here. I mean, this is my understanding that it is the sovereign right of a country to adopt measures to protect human, animal, and plant lives. And so you can't blame any country for implementing those legitimate sanitary and phytosanitary measures and SPS measures for import refusals and also for food losses. Of course, I agree. Non-tariff barrier, NTB, could be the real culprit here. So here my suggestion is, if you disaggregate import refusal by legitimate SPS and non-tariff barriers, while you are analyzing the determinants of import refusal. So instead of having all informations together, it's okay. You can have two categories: that legitimate SPS and another non-trade barriers, and based on that you can analyze the determinants of import refusals. Okay, and it's my session. Well, maybe our discussion will provide much more information on that. Well, let us move to another presentations. It's on issues of food security and the use of bar vector autoregulations approach in analyzing food security. With Sheila Khatun will make the presentation. This is a student at the Department of Economics, Malwana Vashani Science and Technology University, Bangladesh. Ms. Khatun, now you have the floor. Please go ahead. Are you unmuted?
Thank you, Sanem, for giving me the opportunity to present my paper.
You can click, you want to see, okay, I think this is fine. Please go ahead now. Thank you. You can start your presentation. Sheila, please go ahead.
Thank you. Now I present my topic. My presentation topic is a time series analysis of food security with selected macroeconomic variables in Bangladesh by using a vector autoregressive approach. Now I present this topic. I work with my co-author, Dr. Mohammad Nalus Sadiqin, Associate Professor, Department of Economics, Maulana Bashani Science and Technology University. Now I present my presentation. At first, I introduce what is food security. Food security is a situation when all people at all time have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. It emphasizes on the food availability, access, utility, and stability. Before pandemic, the status of food security in Bangladesh was not sound, as it was ranked 83 among 113 countries all over the world, which was the lowest rank among South Asian countries, and it would become more devastating during this pandemic. Here I also mention the status of food security in Bangladesh. As from the pie chart, we see that the food availability is 54.8 out of 100, and quality and safety is 30.6 out of 100, and food accessibility is 60.4 out of 100, which is not sound for a country. Now I mention the dimension of food security. It includes food availability, food access, food utilization, and food stability. Food availability includes transport and distribution of food, storage and processing of food, food production, and food trade. Food access includes intra-household distribution of food, income, and market. Knowledge, cultural tradition, healthcare, childcare, and illness management, clean drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene energy. Food stability includes stability in food availability, stability in food access, and stability in food utilization. The objective of this study is to examine the dynamic relationship between particular macroeconomic variables. Those variables include GDP, population, exchange rate, food production, food price index, and remittance. To show the specific objectives, the food production index is used as a proxy of food security, where food production index indicates the food crops, which are considered edible and contain nutrients. Coffee and tea are excluded because, although edible, they have no nutritive value. In my methodology, I specified the model as food production index is a function of GDP, population, exchange rate, food price index, and remittance. And we use standard vector autoregressive method, which is used for forecasting system of interrelated time series and for analyzing the dynamic impact of endogenous variables. Then we use variance decomposition and impulse response function. Now I discuss about my findings. To estimate the bar, firstly we test stationary where all the variables are not stationary, but after first difference we see that all the variables are stationary. Then we use Johnson test of cointegration, and the result shows that at least 3 cointegration equations exist, which indicate the long-run relationship among the variables. After that, we estimate the bar coefficient, which explains that individually all the variables are statistically insignificant due to multicollinearity. But by following a prior expectation, the result indicating the positive effect on food security, all the variables. I also mentioned here the other statistics from bar model. As we see that R square and adjusted R square are quite high, and also the F statistics, high value of F statistics, which means that the model is statistically significant. The same result also found from the lower value of Akais and Schwartz information criteria. Now I discuss about variance decomposition. Which is used for the quantitative shock of each variable. And we see that food production index itself is the main sources of variation, as 100% in the first year, and all other variables has no impact in that year. The range of the shock then reduced in a smaller amount as 99% in the second year and 96% in the third year, as well as we see in the 10th period 84%. All the other variables such as GDP, population, exchange rate, food price index, and remittance also responsible for the variation of food security in Bangladesh. For example, in the initial period, the shock of GDP does not account for the shock of food security. Gradually, it increases as we see. In the 8th period, it was 3%, and gradually increases as in the 10th period, we see it becomes 3.91%. The similar result also found from population, exchange rate, and food price index. Finally, we summarize the table as the variance decomposition shows that the food production index itself is the highest sources of variation. After that, population, GDP, and remittance provide the maximum variation on food security. Now I discuss about the impulse response result. The impulse response function traces the effect of a shock to one endogenous variable on the other variable in the vector autoregressive model. That is how the economy reacts over time. The red line is the 95% confidence interval, and the blue line is the impulse response result. A one standard deviation from food production index to food production index show a positive impact, but it sharply declined over the period of time. We also see that a standard deviation or shock from GDP to food production index is positive all over the time, but it fluctuated. And then we discuss on food production index to population, which provides a always negative impact, although the impact is smaller in the short run, but in the long run, we see the negative impact. After that, we see the response of food production index to exchange rate. Here we see the up to the 5th year, it becomes positive, but after that time, it becomes negative, and in the last period, that is in the 10th period, it it becomes steady state. The response of food production index to food price index shows the positive impact over the time. Finally, the response of food production index to remittance provide a negative impact in the short run, but after the second period until the sixth period, it provides the positive impact. But after six period, it becomes negative over the period of time. Here I mention some of the recommendation of my paper. Although bar coefficient shows a positive impact on food security, the population, GDP, and remittance provide the maximum variation on food security. Over the period of time, the impulse response result shows that population provide a negative impact on food security along with exchange rate and food price index. So what would be the recommendation? Investment more on population so that they must turn themselves into productive and
Dear presenter, you have 2 minutes left.
Investment more on population so that they must turn themselves into productive and skilled human capital, which will increase the productivity of the workers, hence food security. Reduce the dependency on import of food and sustain the local agricultural growth and development. Finally, productivity must be increased. Population should be controlled and properly manage the demographic dividend to ensure the food security. The demographic dividend is the differences between the number of working age people and non-working age people. If working people is greater than non-working people, then there is a demographic dividend. According to the economist, demographic dividend has 4 benefits, that is improving labor supply, developed human capital, increase the growth of saving, and expand domestic market. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila Khatun, for your presentation. So, here are my quick reactions to your paper. Is that I could not find sufficient theoretical underpinnings for model specification. I mean, why you have chosen that specific model? I went through your paper, but I could not find sufficient theoretical justification for that, theoretical underpinning. And my second is why you have opted for this autoregressive model. Again, I mean, I was just looking for the justification for the use of that particular autoregressive model. Again, I could not find any justifications in the paper. So it's my initial reaction to your paper and presentations. Well, let us move forward to another presentation that's related to compulsory licensing, and presentations is by Dr. Mohammad Zahir Abbas. He is postdoctoral research fellow at Queensland University of Technology. I think it's in Brisbane, Australia. Dr. Abbas, now you have the floor.
Dr. Abbas, kindly unmute yourself.
Okay. Well, I mean, if Dr.
can...
Abbas is with the technical issues, my request, to all participants, if you have any, questions or comments on these presentations, please provide them in the chat box.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey, for the kind introduction.
Over to you, Dr. Salim.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Salim and Shoaib Ahmed for providing me this opportunity to present my findings of my research. The topic of my presentation is potential role of compulsory licensing in the post-COVID recovery context, challenges and prospects. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Faculty of Business and Law, QUT Brisbane, Australia, and I have been working on the access to medicines issues in my master's thesis, in my PhD thesis, and many of my publications. Presentation overview: what is compulsory licensing? What is its context? What are challenges in using this policy option? What are recent developments in relation to compulsory licensing of patents? I'm talking about the compulsory licensing of patents. So it is important to know what are patents. Patents provide exclusive rights for a period of 20 years for innovative technologies. And without the permission of the patent holder, no one can make those patented articles, no one can sell them, no one can offer for sale or import or market those protected technologies. So what happens? There is no competition. The patent holder enjoys monopoly rights or exclusive rights. And when there is no competition, the prices go high. And when it happens in case of health-related technologies, it becomes an issue of life and death, because medicines or vaccines or health-related products, they are not a luxury. They are essential for our life and for our health. So what is compulsory licensing? A compulsory licensing, a license is an authorization given by a national authority to a person without or against the consent of the title holder or patent holder for the exploitation of a subject matter protected by a patent or other intellectual property rights. It is a statutorily created license that allows certain people to pay a royalty or adequate remuneration to the patentee and use an invention without the patentee's permission. It is important to provide royalty so that the patent holder has his financial or commercial interests are protected to some extent. A compulsory license can be issued for use by the government, by its agents, or by third parties, including corporate bodies and private individuals. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the importance of compulsory licensing, because governments, even in economically advanced countries, have struggled to meet the health needs of their populations. And I think that compulsory licensing has a role in economic recovery in the post-COVID era, because directly it reduces the burden on health systems by reducing the cost of health technologies. And indirectly, it has an impact, a positive impact on the overall economic development, on the overall economic recovery, because as soon as it is important for the economic recovery to get to control the COVID pandemic as soon as possible. And if we allow intellectual property barriers to restrict the scale manufacturing of vaccines and other health-related technologies, the COVID pandemic will linger on, and it will keep negatively impacting our economy at a global level, especially in the developing countries. Okay, I will provide a brief context to compulsory licensing. The English Statute of Monopolies 1623 is one of the earliest legal instruments in which concept of compulsory licensing was incorporated. So the concept of CL or compulsory licensing is quite old. It originated in 1623. Vienna Convention 1873 allowed compulsory licensing as a safeguard measure in situations where the public interest should require it. The Paris Convention 1878 provided for compulsory licensing under Article 5A2 in order to prevent abuse of exclusive patent rights. Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works 1886 provided for compulsory licensing in case of broadcasting and related rights. Rome Convention 1961 recognized the grant of compulsory licensing. I'm talking about the international framework. I'm not going into specific jurisdictions. So at global level, at international level, these were the statutes. These were the conventions or international instruments that provided for the right for the policy option of compulsory licensing. WTO period, the WTO TRIPS agreement provided for minimum standards to harmonize divergent domestic laws and provided mandatory rights for right holders. Prior to the WTO, prior to 1995, the pharmaceutical drugs, they were excluded from patent protection. The national governments or the nation states, they had an option either to provide patent protection for pharmaceutical drugs or exclude them from patent protection. It was their discretion. But after 1995, after the establishment of the WTO TRIPS, of the WTO, it became mandatory for all WTO members to provide patent protection for in all fields of technology, including pharmaceutical drugs. Keeping in view the practical implications of patent protection in third world countries, TRIPS agreement provided mechanisms to override patents through legitimate means. And these mechanisms were not provided easily. The third world countries, they had to struggle for it. There were lengthy negotiations. The third world countries were led by India, Brazil, and South Africa in those negotiations. And there were hard fought flexibilities that the third world countries, they had to fight for these public health flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement. Though the term compulsory licensing has not been used in the TRIPS agreement, a set of conditions have been stipulated under Article 31 of the TRIPS agreement for grant of non-voluntary or compulsory license. Article 31 does not provide a list of grounds for the issuance of compulsory licenses. So it provides further flexibility to the WTO TRIPS, to WTO members to make their own list of the grounds for compulsory licensing. It provides flexibility of freedom. The Doha Ministerial Declaration 2001 reaffirmed that each member has the right to grant compulsory licenses and the freedom to determine the grounds upon which such licenses are granted. Challenges. Although theoretically, the compulsory licensing safeguard was included in the TRIPS agreement, and the economically advanced members of the WTO, they consented to it at the TRIPS, at the WTO forum and at the Doha forum, they consented to it unanimously that these flexibilities, health-related flexibilities should be there in the TRIPS agreement. But practically, they hindered their practical use, the actual use of these flexibilities. Practical implementation of compulsory licensing safeguard has remained a controversial issue in international trade relations. Political and economic pressure exerted by developed countries prevents developing and least developed countries from exercising their rights under the TRIPS agreement and the Doha Declaration. Whenever there was use of the compulsory licensing option, there was retaliation, there was backlash from economically advanced countries like US, Japan, EU, and pharmaceutical industry. I can't cover all the examples in this presentation, so I will focus on only on one country, Thailand, how its use of the compulsory licensing was retaliated by the pharmaceutical industry and by the advanced countries. In 2000, the US threatened Thailand with trade sanctions when the Thai government attempted to issue a compulsory license for didanosine and HIV/AIDS drug. So Thailand was considering the use of compulsory licensing in 2000, but because of the US pressure, they shied away from using that option. But in 2006 and 2007, over a period of several months, Thailand issued 3 compulsory licenses. The US Department of State and the United States Trade Representative, or USTR, asked Thailand to reconsider its compulsory licensing decision, to withdraw its compulsory licensing decision. The Deputy USTR tried to exert pressure through diplomatic channels and delivered a message to the Thai embassy in Washington, DC. Thai government officials described the message as bullying. It was so threatening. The European Commissioner wrote a letter to the Thai government to warn about the pharmaceutical industry's reaction to the use of compulsory licensing. In March 2007, Abbott Laboratories retaliated and withdrew the registration of several drugs from Thailand. So this is how the industry retaliated. On March 20, the US Chamber of Commerce released its survey report emphasizing that issuance of compulsory licenses may jeopardize international investments. So Thailand was threatened with the loss of foreign direct investment. If you use the compulsory licensing option, you may lose the foreign direct investment. On March 30, Thailand was elevated to the USTR Special 301 Report Priority Watch List. USTR, our Special 301 mechanism, is out of the WTO. It's not a mechanism within the WTO. It's USA's own national mechanism. They evaluate the intellectual property protection standards in across the globe, and they prepare a list of countries on the basis of their level of protection and on the basis of piracy and infringement of intellectual property rights in those countries. So as a result of the use of a very legitimate option of compulsory licensing, Thailand was elevated to the USTR Special 301 Report Priority Watch List. So it faced the economic sanctions from the US, the threat of economic sanctions. In July 2007, the USTR withdrew duty-free access to the US market for 3 Thai products. So the pressure tactics keep going. Recent developments in the wake of COVID-19.
Dear presenter, you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, there have been some encouraging developments. I will provide an overview. Several countries are passing resolutions and reconsidering their national patent laws to prepare themselves for the foreseen uses of compulsory licensing in response to COVID-19 by improving their legislative mechanisms. For example, on March 17, 2020, Chile's legislative laid the legal groundwork to potentially use compulsory licensing safeguard. On March 20, 2020, the Education, Culture, Science and Technology Commission of Ecuador National Assembly passed a resolution asking Ecuador President and Minister of Public Health to grant compulsory licensing on urgently needed COVID-related health technologies. On March 23, 2020, France enacted emergency law number 2020-290 in response to COVID-19, which introduced a new and wide provision into the French Public Health Code. On March 24, Canada, which already provided a compulsory licensing mechanism under its national patent laws, amended its Patent Act to make it faster for the government to utilize the compulsory licensing option in response to the current pandemic. On March 27, Germany enacted the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases in Human Act, which empowers the Federal Minister to authorize the use of compulsory licensing. On March 29, the National Assembly of Hungary enacted legislation to allow compulsory licensing. These resolutions and the enabling of legislative measures send a clear signal to brand name pharmaceutical corporations that governments will not put up with the delays in assessing COVID-19 health-related technologies. Let me conclude this discussion. The actual use of compulsory licensing safeguard has remained a controversial issue in international trade relations. This study proposes that the use of compulsory licensing as a safeguard should be backed by community support or civil society mobilization. Recent developments in relation to compulsory licensing are encouraging, but economically advanced countries like the US, Japan, and EU need to recognize that compulsory licensing is not a violation of patent rights. It is part of the bargain, and it is an absolutely legitimate policy option. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Abbas. Here, I would say I'm listening exactly questions, but my curiosity. Well, you tell me what motivated you to focus on Article 31 and Article 31 BIS, which is the declarations and particularly related to public health. And this Article 31 relates to other uses of IP without authorization of the right holders. What motivated you to focus on this to contain infection, COVID infection, instead of the proposal of India and South Africa, which they made in October 2020 at WTO, on the waiver on the implementation, application, and enforcement of 4 sections of the WTO agreement. Four section of the second part of the WTO agreement. And the sections are section 1, 4, 5, and 7. They pertain to copyright and related rights, industrial design, patent, and the protection of undisclosed information. And this waiver proposal has been endorsed already by 64 countries and in WTO and fled This was also endorsed by US and Biden's administration on May 5th this year. So instead of focusing on this broader whatever issues, what motivated you to focus simply on the issues of compulsory license? And that's my question. So okay, we'll discuss. In our discussion part. Well, now I invite Dr. Arpita to comment on all these four papers. Dr. Arpita, now you have the floor. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you to Salim and to Sanem for the invite, to Soeb and everyone, and hope you are well wherever you are. Now, these are four interesting papers looking into the four totally different aspects. So I will try to spend kind of 4 minutes on each paper given the timeline that I have. So if I look into the paper of Dr. Altun, I would go to the first comment that Salim had made in the chat box on this paper. Like, you know, when you talk about North and South, it is today a world of US versus China kind of a world, and you have China and, you know, Vietnam and other developing countries on the one side. So today we don't have a developing country which is uniform or a homogeneous developing country. Now, even if you look at a country like India and Vietnam and China, you would see Vietnam being so close to China had been so affected by the global value chain in the initial phases, much higher than India, has done much well by integrating into the trade with the developed country, removing the trade barriers. Now, it would be very nice if you are able to actually develop some kind of a heterogeneity among these countries. Secondly, you know, US process of bringing the FDI back home has not always been successful. Like if you go back from 2018 till date, many companies which tried to move to the US are again coming back. Like an example of that is Adidas. So how do you talk it about? Because we are talking about post-COVID. So post-COVID, if you want to attract and be part of the global value chain, you need to have certain policies and procedures in place to attract that kind of an FDI. Now, and that FDI is of course becoming more fourth IR oriented and technology oriented FDI. And if you are going towards, you know, if you build your strength on skilled workforce, on startups, on technologies, that is where probably you are going to get the FDI, because you rightly have put in a very important point that developing countries have large consumer base. So, you know, wherever you produce, you have to come to some of these developing countries to sell. So suppose if they have skilled workforce, they can become both the production and consumption hub along with the right technology. You also look at a world where, you know, the multilateral organizations are a bit defunct. Like, you know, you don't mention about them, but when you talk about growing protectionism, the role of the trade agreements and they are becoming very, very important when you have to counter trade wars. So what is your countering mechanism? If you highlight that in your conclusion, I think your conclusions will strengthen quite a bit. Coming to the next paper, I definitely take away from where Dr. Pandey has left. You know, WTO SPS agreement, as members of the WTO, and many of us are and will be in the South Asia region, we can have our own standard. Even India can have its own standard, and Bangladesh. What you have to do is to scientifically justify that your standard is correct. So if I am challenging an American standard, I have to scientifically prove that the standard is not correct. And where I think the developing countries suffer is that we do not have enough data or technology, or we don't trace our product to the farm to scientifically prove it. See, again, how the refusals are actually taken and placed are and how a country showcases a refusal data is very complicated. But if you are able to actually address the refusal by some kind of a HS code or a ITC code that you can map it with the trade flow, I think your analysis will be much more robust, because the impact of the refusals are very different. So let me give you an example. A fruit product refusal and a fruit refusal, even if I hold on a fruit for 5 days for just on the ground that your label is not correct, and I'm arguing the fruit may get damaged because it is a perishable product. So the analysis is very different from the product which is perishable to the product which is non-perishable. So now if you do it by a perishable and non-perishable product, you will get much more clearer picture for your audience and your readers. If you put in some justification of the definitions, because each country RFS portal defines a rejection in a different way, like the US. Because if you write a filthy product, US actually gives a definition of what a filthy product is. So when you do a rejection, the rejection grounds can be very severe to not so severe. Not so severe is labeling. When there is a labeling issue, they actually allow you to relabel. So that is something you may look into. But when there is a serious ground that you may have used a pesticide, or it has a pest which is of unknown nature, which like semolina, or you may have something like you are using a banned fertilizer in your field, which is banned in the US, then your product has a high chance of your rejection. Now, because once you analyze the rejection in a very nicer, in a more clearer way, as you have also written that it is a work in progress, you will be able to put certain logic to your key findings. For example, you found that Bhutan is able to sell to US better and with lesser rejection than India, but you are not able to argue why, because we are producing more agriculture. But it's not true. It is true because Bhutan is more organic than us. It is low chemical. So the rejections which are happening for chemicals and pesticides have lower chances in Bhutan than in India. So again, what is the impact of the rejection? Impact of the rejection is not always food loss. Food loss happens when the food is destroyed, which you have said in your report at one point in time. But if you can clarify that it happens when the food is destroyed, or it is a perishable, which is, and you are not, even if it is allowed in, it loses the shelf life. So these are two situations when the food loss actually happen. And the third situation when the food loss may not happen, and import refusal has a bigger impact on developing country, is a permanent ban. Like we have a ban in milk, we have a ban in orange, many are mangoes nowadays. So, you know, that part, you have to isolate from the food loss part. But it is a very, very interesting attempt, and I think that, and you have rightly said, it is a work in progress, and I would request you to take it forward, because very few people have worked in this area. Regarding the time series data for Bangladesh and looking into the food security, I think, you know, FAO today defines, it has changed its definition. It has moved from food security to nutrition security as a definition. But we as developing countries actually stick to the concept of a food security first and then to the nutrition security. And that is what you actually began, Ms. Khatun, in your paper. You talk about, you know, green revolution, because why do we do green revolution? We want to bring in the agricultural production to the level that we become domestically secure and we are able to feed our large populations. Now, the other thing is that from there you actually totally ignored the hunger component of the storyline, because, you know, in countries like India and Bangladesh, nutrition security can also be a problem for much of the high income population. So I can be earning and I can be having junk food. So, you know, nutrition security is today a problem for the developed country also. So I would when it is a Bangladesh specific analysis, I would rather look into a food security where you are not able to meet your basic food, like, you know, rice, pulses, and a basic diet which requires you to actually survive. Then you go for a nutritional diet which requires you to be healthy. Now, so also when you do this kind of analysis, if there is a government definition, you can take it, or if there are South Asian best practices definition, you can take it. Now, once you try to put those definition and analyze, you know, you come with more constructive policy suggestions. Like, you are using a very complicated model, and that's what Dr. Pandey has said. But after all this complicated model, we should not come to a conclusion that if we produce more and have less people, we will be food secure. You know, we can come out into something more innovative, like, you know, how do we actually enhance, reduce the food losses in the supply chain, or should we have a food security policy? Does that work? Something to that effect. If you are able to put that, I think this paper will be a very unique paper. And what do you do for the vulnerable group and their access? You know, the food security, the access of the vulnerable group is very important. Whether you give free ration, how do you reach them? Now, coming to the last paper on compulsory licensing, you know, this is a big debate as you come to this current scenario. And Dr. Abbas, I think where Dr. Pandey begins, and probably where you started your paper and where you missed it out, because your story began with what happened pre-WTO and WTO, but at the end of the paper, you completely rejected what is happening in the WTO now, but there is no information. So that's where the paper actually needs to, wherever you have provided an information, it is an interesting information. We do realize your constraint for not having enough data in place, and it is a desk-based research. But still, if you can divide your paper into something like your key research questions, your methodology, and you begin with what is happening in the WTO then and happening in the WTO now, what countries were doing then and what they are doing now, and when you have a story, if you just end the story, it will really help. Like, you know, Thai is completely like a mystery story, what happens now to Thailand and US. And if you just take USTR report and take out Thai as in your IPR watch list, I think, you know, they do 100 countries and they put around 50 countries in IPR watch list, but that doesn't mean that each of them has the Thai compulsory licensing problem. So they may put Thai on the watch list because there is a piracy issue, there is a music piracy issue. So, you know, we need to actually link it. In your paper, you have also, you know, used other paper and articles, and you have somewhere criticized Pfizer's and others. There is two sets of opinion, and each of them have their own opinion. For example, let me look at from the point of view of Pfizer. Pfizer will say, look, I have invested in the drug, I have made it something, I have invested in a vaccine, I can't make it free. You know, and now the question then, therefore, in your paper is, are we talking about availability, affordability, or both? And in developing countries, I think we are talking about affordability and availability, because even if it is available and not priced rightly, it is not accessible. So if you target this from the point of affordability and availability, and what can be done in the WTO, given that India and South Africa paper has received consent, and how do you want this to progress, given that US has said yes and European Union has said I don't want to do it, which is very strange. And India and EU are relaunching their trade negotiations. So since you're talking about subcommittees and how to take it, if you put that perspective a little bit with your legal lens, which you have applied on the other countries, etc., and really painstakingly taken out their, their regulations. I think if you're fitting the domestic regulations into the positions in the trade negotiations and agreements, the paper will be one of very rich papers, like and very recent, on a very recent topic. I leave my comments here because I would also like to keep the discussions open. I do have a few comments, but I would bring it back because the authors will then have time to respond.
Thank you, Dr. Prita, for very comprehensive comments and suggestions. Okay, let me.
First of all, I want to thank to Dr. Arpita Mukherjee for her.
Dr. Abdullah, we'll get back to you.
We'll get back to you.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, now the floor is open for discussion. If there are any participants, I mean, who want to put questions directly to the panelists, well, please raise your hand, and I request the organizer to manage that part. And in the meantime, there are some questions and suggestions in the chat box. Okay, so there are two questions to Dr. Abdullah also. And one is basically related to vaccine justice. That is the way, the speed developed countries are vaccinating their people, their citizens, and the availability of vaccines to low-income, developing or least developed countries. I mean, you see that vast difference. So here, I mean, in the process, how you are going to ensure that vaccine justice between developed and developing countries, or to put it another way, between North and South. That is one question for you. And another question is basically with regard to the status of Global South. I mean, here in Global South is basically dominated by China together with other outside big countries. So, I mean, how you can have, I mean, that perception of Global South dominated by few countries applicable to other, I mean, smaller and much weaker developing countries? I mean, these are basic two questions to Dr. Altum. If you want to respond, okay, now you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, actually, the real question is whether China is a North or South. I think an important question. Maybe previously South country, but by the new developments, China leading the Global South, and as if the same algorithm with the developed countries since 1999, as we know, the expansion of global value chains was triggered by developed nations. And the new algorithm of Chinese expansion is very similar to this. Thus, really, it is much difficult to separate China and North countries recently. But what China succeeded is the changing dimension of the coming algorithms so far. Why? Since previous developed nations now trying to seek ways to regain this competitive power. So China break the previous algorithm. Thus, we believe that this may be a new wave of followed by other South countries. First, this is important. Otherwise, if South-South cooperation couldn't be succeeded into develop further, the same North-South competition probably still continue, even just China become a North country. But if South, Global South, can realize and be aware of the changing dynamics and try to cooperate among themselves, even by finding ways to royalty and license development, finding ways to cooperate in generating capital goods, and develop some ways to construct new global value chains, this may be changed. Otherwise, we can again say that we have a new North countries. Another point, India now following China, and probably after 2030, India's economy probably will be the second biggest economy in the world. Even in 2050s, India surpassed USA considerably. First China, second India probably. Thus, India's participation into this competition may be much related with South-oriented expansion, since India represents South more than China in one dimension. As to first question, vaccination is a real problem, but this transformation led by China, and China succeeded in vaccination. But I believe that in 2 years, probably not much long term, many countries, even in many South countries, succeeded in vaccination. But also, high-income countries in any way try to find ways to contribute to these vaccination process. Otherwise, you know, the world is highly integrated. So survive together. There is no other option. If we can survive together. Otherwise, if a problem continues somewhere else, again, this may come again to infection, come again to others with mutations or something. So a global community needs a very joint collaboration, and thus I believe that vaccination will be solved up to a certain level in 2 years. And important problem is if new infections, pandemics arises, at this time, we may need to discuss some different points. Thank you very much. Also, Dr. Arpita, thank you again.
Yeah.
We have disaggregated
If you want
data
to
share
respond
as
to my
well.
question.
We have disaggregated data, and we focus on big data of the international trade and global value chains. Here, we just find possibility to share the macro view. But as you say, thank you very much. In disaggregated data, the picture is totally different, and really, when making analysis, separating China and other global south may be inevitable, may be mandatory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Altun. Well, Dr. Panchalingam, there is one question, for you. And that is, what is your recommendations to minimize food loss? Okay, do you want to respond that question?
Yeah, I think I also responded in the chat, but I can explain it again. So I think there are like non-food safety related issues as well as food safety related issues. So the non-food safety issues are mainly labeling issues and misbranding, things like that, which I think kind of easily fixable with some technological knowledge, which can be done sooner. And I also based on my co-author's response, that we can, the exporting countries can focus on improving the domestic food safety standards, which is kind of reflected in our exports. So strengthening the local standards might be the first step to, for example, using the color additives comes up as a top within the top 6 issues, which is locally also could be an issue which can be improved based on the improve as a first step by improving the domestic food safety standards.
Okay, do you want to respond on some of the issues raised by Dr. Arpita?
Yes, I think Dr. Arpita has a comment.
I think she has responded to the issues raised by me on in the chat box. She has responded. One place because you are doing a good model. One area I'll give you a very quick solution to your food safety versus non-food safety issue. If you go to the WTO SPS committee, if you look at the queries raised by the countries, they are all well tabulated, and they are matching with the measures taken by the country with a 6 months kind of a lag. So you will be able to then, if you match this database with that database, you will be able to see which are the issues which are good enough to raise in the WTO. So they are serious issue which you can call it as a measure taken by the US, which is which can be harmful for a developing country. So that food, that risk you can be able to isolate, versus the risk where the developing countries, which you rightly pointed out, will be taking something that they do on their own. And you also said that you are trying to link it with the trade flow pattern, right?
Yes.
You're trying to link it with the trade volume, and that is very simple to match. If you look at the trade volume, and then you look at the trade risk. So if say we are among the top 3 importer, if we are among the top 3 or top 4 exporters of shrimp, and we face the highest problem, that's one way. But if we are not that and we face the highest problem, then the solution is different. So once you start correlating it with the trade data and WTO data, much of your analysis will be clearer, and you will get much of the information. See, if you're not getting the information on the food loss, you just delete that food loss 2 words from your paper and just stick to the paper on import refusal, and I think you can easily convert it into a journal article. By bringing in food loss, you're creating the complexity.
I agree. Yeah. That's the point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now let me turn to Sheila. Well, Sheila, dear, you have one questions in the chat box, and that is related. The question is, how are you going to balance the interest of food importing and food exporting countries? That is the question. Do you want to address that question? Sheila Khatun, are you there? No. Then let me turn to Dr. Abbas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. First of all, I will respond to your question. What was my motivation to research on these issues? It takes me back to 2012 when I was doing Masters in Law at International Islamic University, Islamabad, Pakistan. At that time, in March 2012, India issued a compulsory license to generic drug manufacturer NATCO for manufacture and sale of Bayer Corporation's cancer drug, sorafenib. And it created a lot of controversy. It was in the news, and I decided to do my master research on this case study of India's first compulsory licensing. Later, after completing my master's, I decided to do my PhD thesis on access to medicines, and I chose India's patent opposition model as my case study. So I have been working on the policy safeguards provided in the TRIPS agreement to deal with the issue of access to medicines. I have worked on parallel importation, tiered pricing, paragraph 6 system, article 31 bis, and compulsory licensing, and other policy options that are available to the developing countries, because I'm from a developing country, and I can understand the issues faced by the less privileged or underprivileged populations in the developing countries when they lack access to innovative health technologies. And health issues, they lead to further poverty. It's a vicious cycle. When a family goes into that vicious cycle, it's very hard for the families to come out of that. And it was my motivation because I have personally, I feel the pain for the people. And I did my master's research, my PhD research, and several other articles on these issues, and I'm working. And now I come to question of Dr. Mukherjee. First of all, I appreciate her feedback, and I will definitely benefit from her feedback. As regards the WTO TRIPS waiver proposal, it is not possible to include that discussion in this paper because it's a topic, it's itself a topic for another study. And I'm working on the WTO TRIPS waiver proposal, and there's a flurry of activity. There's so much happening in that context that it's hard to follow. Even I have to spare a lot of time to catch up with those developments. I will do a separate study on that, and I will publish and present at a later stage. But I personally feel that it would be inappropriate to include or merge that whole topic in this study. I kept it specifically to the compulsory licensing of patents. And her second opinion, second comment was regarding the opposite perspective of the pharmaceutical industry, because they invest in the research and development (R&D), and it is their right to recoup their investments and to earn profits on their investments. I fully agree with this. I have no problem. My argument is not to dissolve each and every pharmaceutical patent compulsorily and to harm the corporate interests of the pharmaceutical industry. My argument is compulsory licensing is part of the bargain. It is part of the negotiation. It was agreed by all the WTO member states that we need public health safeguard mechanisms within the TRIPS system. Otherwise, there will be serious health issues. People will be dying and we will have no options to make the drugs affordable for the people. So the WTO member countries, they have a right to use this flexibility when they need to use it, when there is an abuse of the exclusive rights. And developed countries, economically advanced countries, they have actually used this safeguard. In 2001, after the terror attack in the US, there was the anthrax infection in the US, and they needed to expand the manufacturing of Cipro. It was antidote for anthrax. And the Bayer Corporation, the patent holder for Cipro, was not able to meet the demand for Cipro. And they used this threat of compulsory licensing to negotiate lower prices and to push Bayer Corporation to enhance its supply at a reduced price. So when US is using this safeguard, it is okay for them, because they have more power, they have economic might. But when a third world country like Brazil used it, when India used it, when South Africa used it, when Thailand used it, they have a problem with the same mechanism, which they have agreed to. So these are double standards, and it is my responsibility as a researcher, as a researcher from a developing country, to raise these issues, to talk about these issues. These are injustices caused by misuse of power by advanced countries. When it comes to their needs, they use the same mechanism. They justify its use. But when it comes to the third world countries, they have the tendency to twist their arms, to put extraordinary pressure on them outside the WTO. WTO has its own mechanisms, but they use mechanisms outside the WTO to put unnecessary pressure on the developing countries. So this was my point. I fully respect their rights. I fully respect their patent exclusive rights, but they use it in a fair way, and there should be no double standards for the developing world and the developed world. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Abbas. Well, here, I mean, let me put this way. I mean, why I asked that question is, if you want to contain this COVID, then you need access to vaccine, access to pharmaceutical products or drugs. Number 3, access to medical equipment, and also access to medical accessories. When you talk about compulsory license, that covers only patent. It doesn't cover industrial design. There won't be any compulsory license for industrial design. There won't be any industrial license for the undisclosed information or trade secrets. For example, I mean, just look at the PPE that could be protected as industrial design. But your compulsory license doesn't cover that industrial design. That's why I was asking you what motivated you, I mean, to focus on particularly on patent and also this, I mean, vaccines and pharmaceutical products, not in other, I mean, factors that helps you to contain this COVID. And that was my, I mean, fundamental, and that was my questions. Okay. Thank you for your response. Now, I'll ask, I mean, organizer, particularly Dr. Shalim, I mean, is there any participants who wants to put direct questions or want to make, I mean, some observation comments? Maybe if we have time, so maybe we can ask for maybe 2-3 minutes. If none, then I would prefer, I mean, to close the session with my, I mean, with my thanks to Dr. Arpita Mukherjee, Dr. Abdullah Altun, Dr. Panchalingam, Sheila Khatun, and Dr. Mohammad Zahir Abbas for making this session very engaging and also making very productive. I thank you all. I mean, in fact, the COVID pandemic and I mean, it has resulted in an economic crisis. The pandemic and the resulting health and economic crisis are the manifestations of the failure of traditional development models and also the failure of the traditional process of globalization. I mean, if you want sustainable and inclusive path out of this pandemic, then we need cooperation among both South and North countries. And also, we need to reimagine this globalization and its components. I mean, here we need cooperation and coordinations, and particularly in monetary policy, in fiscal policies, in macro-prudential policies, in trade policies, and much more importantly, on technology policy and social policy. Then to mitigate the adverse, I mean, impact of this pandemic, or maybe, I mean, of any future disasters. I mean, that's my conclusion. With this note, I close these sessions and thank organizer Sanem, I mean, on behalf of the team, that is panelists and also discussant and participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey, and thank you, Dr. Arpita Mukherjee, and 4 distinguished presenters. I think it was a wonderful session and a very kind of the way we started the conference. I think that will really guide us over the next 3 days. Thank you so much.